In a small town, Grace, a struggling single mother, stumbles into a quaint toy shop just days before Christmas. Little does she know, the mysterious old toy maker, Mr. Hawkins, holds secrets that connect her to a past she never knew and a legacy that could change her life. As financial pressures mount and an unexpected figure threatens the shop's survival, Grace must fight for a place where love, family, and hope intertwine. Will Grace uncover the truth before it's too late? And can the bonds of newfound family overcome the shadows of the past? Watch to see how this heartwarming story unfolds. It was one of those frosty mornings when the air was thick with the smell of snow and chimney smoke, and each step left a crunch underfoot. Grace hadn't planned to end up on Cedarville's Main Street that morning, her daughter Emma clinging to her hand as they walked past storefronts decorated with blinking lights and candy canes. But a cold wind had blown through Grace's life a week before Christmas. She'd lost her job, just like that, with her boss muttering apologies about budget cuts. Now, here she was, down to her last few dollars, her heart pounding as she looked for some way to make her daughter's Christmas wish come true. Emma was only 6, but even she could feel her mother's worry. As they passed the small toy shop at the corner of the street, Emma tugged at her hand, her face lighting up at the window display. Penny Whistle Toys. The sign read in big, faded letters. Behind the glass, an assortment of wooden toys stood neatly arranged. A train, a dollhouse, a spinning top, all crafted with remarkable detail. Emma's eyes settled on a small train, red and green with golden wheels, sitting proudly in the middle of the display. Grace felt a pang. Her little girl had been such a trooper all year, never asking for much. Just one small gift, she thought, to make Emma smile on Christmas morning. The door creaked open, and the jingle of a bell sounded above them as they stepped into the warm, quiet shop. The place felt like stepping back in time, with shelves of wooden toys and the smell of fresh pine and polish. Grace was almost lost in thought when a voice startled her. "Can I help you?" asked a tall, thin man with silver hair and a lined face, eyes sharp but somehow kind. His name tag read Mr. Hawkins, and he looked at Grace and Emma with a slightly puzzled expression, as though he hadn't expected customers that morning. Grace hesitated, feeling suddenly self-conscious. We're just looking," she stammered. Emma's gaze was still fixed on the little train, and Mr. Hawkins noticed, his brow softening. Without another word, he took the train from the display and handed it to Emma. "This one seems to like you," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Emma's face lit up, but Grace stepped forward, shaking her head. "Oh no, we can't," she began, her voice faltering. She knew they couldn't afford it, and the last thing she wanted was to take charity. Mr. Hawkins held up a hand, his voice gentle. "No charge. It's Christmas, after all." Grace swallowed, the kindness catching her off guard. She nodded, managing a "thank you." But as she turned to leave, Mr. Hawkins spoke again, his words unexpected. "You know, if you need some extra work," he paused, glancing around the quiet store. "I could use a hand around here, just for the holiday season, if you're interested." Grace's heart raced. She had no idea why this man, who knew nothing about her, would offer a job to a stranger. But then again, life had a funny way of throwing things at her when she least expected it. She thought of Emma, the bills piling up at home, the groceries she'd have to buy to make Christmas dinner. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'd like that." The old man's face softened. "Start tomorrow morning, then." The next day, Grace arrived early, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup as she stepped into the warm shop. Mr. Hawkins was already at work, sanding down a piece of wood with careful precision, his movements steady and focused. Grace noticed he worked without any machines, as if each toy was crafted by his own hands. She watched him in silence, amazed by his patience. As she swept the floors and dusted the shelves, Grace felt the quiet comfort of the little shop settle around her. Mr. Hawkins was a man of few words, but she noticed small acts of kindness, like how he set aside a bag of groceries for her at the end of the day, or brought Emma little wooden trinkets. In the evenings, as they closed up, he would sometimes linger by the window, looking out at the street with a faraway expression. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. One evening, after they closed up, Mr. Hawkins handed her an old, worn envelope. "Found this in the back room today. Not sure why I kept it all these years." Grace glanced at the envelope, noting the faded handwriting and an old postmark from a town far away. It was addressed to Mr. James Hawkins. She felt a pang of curiosity but slipped the letter into her bag, deciding to look at it later. Days passed, and Christmas drew closer. On Christmas Eve, Mr. Hawkins seemed quieter than usual, his movements slower. Grace could sense a sadness around him that she hadn't seen before. He paused at the window, looking out as snow began to fall softly outside. After a moment, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Did you ever wonder about family you've lost?" he asked, surprising her with the question. She nodded, feeling a strange connection to his words. She'd grown up with her grandmother, who'd raised her but had passed on a few years ago. Grace had no other family, at least none she knew of. Mr. Hawkins went silent, his face lost in thought. He seemed to wrestle with something, and Grace wondered if he, too, carried a story of loss and loneliness. The following day, Christmas morning, dawned crisp and cold. Grace arrived with Emma, carrying a small gift she had managed to buy for Mr. Hawkins, a tiny snow globe she'd found at a thrift store, the scene inside a miniature toy shop with snow falling gently over it. She handed it to him, and for a moment, he looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else. Gratitude, maybe, or even affection. "Thank you," he said quietly, taking the snow globe in his hands and looking at it as if it held some kind of magic. And just then, as the three of them stood there in the warm glow of the shop, something shifted in the air. A sense of belonging, of family, settled over them. Emma tugged on Mr. Hawkins's sleeve, asking him to tell her the story of the toys. And as he began, Grace felt for the first time in years a sense of peace. But there was one more twist to come, one that would connect Grace to Mr. Hawkins in a way neither could have imagined. The shop was busy that morning, bustling with last-minute shoppers. Grace was surprised by the steady flow of customers, each person in search of a special gift. Mr. Hawkins seemed energized by the activity, his usually quiet manner coming alive as he chatted with parents and children alike, recommending toys, sharing stories about his work. It was as if, for one day, he'd found a connection with the town, the place he had lived in for decades but rarely opened up to. Grace watched him closely, studying the way his face softened when he smiled at children, how his eyes lit up when they admired his handiwork. She felt she was seeing a different side of him, something deeply personal that he kept hidden most of the time. Emma, delighted to be part of the holiday excitement, dashed from shelf to shelf, admiring each toy with the wide-eyed wonder that only a child could have. Toward the afternoon, as the store quieted down, Emma came across a dusty old chest in the corner of the back room. "Mommy, look!" she called, pointing to it with an excited grin. Grace followed her and crouched down, studying the chest's brass lock, slightly tarnished with age. There was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the edges of her memory. Mr. Hawkins came over, frowning slightly. "Ah, that old thing," he murmured, seeming almost reluctant to look at it. "Had it for years. Don't even remember what's inside." But Grace felt a pull, an urge to open it. She carefully lifted the lid, revealing a few items stacked neatly inside. There were faded postcards, a wooden figurine of a dog, and an old photograph that caught her eye. It was of a young woman with soft brown skin, holding a small child, a baby with bright eyes. Her heart skipped a beat. The woman looked eerily familiar, and as she looked closer, Grace felt her pulse quicken. This was her grandmother. It had to be. Grace turned to Mr. Hawkins, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this? This woman? She looks just like my grandmother." Mr. Hawkins froze, his eyes widening as he studied the photograph in her hand. The color drained from his face, his hands shaking slightly. That's my daughter," he said, his voice cracking. "She left home years ago, never came back. I thought I'd lost her." Grace's heart pounded as she processed his words. Could it be true? Could the old toy maker she had worked with for weeks be her grandfather? She glanced back at the photo, the connection too strong to ignore. But why had her grandmother never told her? Emma, sensing the tension, tugged on Grace's arm, looking between her mother and Mr. Hawkins with wide, questioning eyes. "Mommy, is he family?" Grace took a shaky breath, her mind racing. She thought back to the stories her grandmother used to tell her, little pieces about a family left behind, a town she never mentioned by name. The pieces began to fit together, and a wave of emotions hit her. Joy, confusion, a pang of loss for all the time they could have had together if she'd only known sooner. That evening, after the shop had closed, Mr. Hawkins sat in the back room, staring at the photograph with a mixture of wonder and regret. Grace joined him, sitting down across from him, her voice soft. "Why didn't she ever come back?" she asked, her words tinged with sadness. Mr. Hawkins sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to come from a place of buried pain. "She left when she was young, wanted to see the world. I didn't approve at first. We had our arguments. And when she left, we were both too stubborn to reach out. I always thought she'd come back someday, but as the years went by, I guess I gave up hope." Grace could hear the regret in his voice, and it struck a chord in her heart. She couldn't imagine the pain of losing a child, the ache of wondering where they were, if they were safe, if they would ever return. She reached out, placing a hand over his. "I wish I'd known sooner." They sat in silence for a long moment, letting the reality of their newfound connection sink in. Mr. Hawkins finally broke the silence, his voice filled with a bittersweet hope. "You and Emma, you're here now. That's what matters." As the days went by, their bond deepened. Grace saw Mr. Hawkins not just as a boss, but as a grandfather she'd never known. And he, in turn, seemed to soften, his gruff exterior fading away as he embraced his new role. Each evening after closing, he shared stories of his daughter, of Grace's grandmother, stories she had never heard before, stories of a spirited young woman who loved adventure, who had a heart as big as the world, but never lost her love for her family. One evening, as Emma played with her new dollhouse, Mr. Hawkins shared a particularly poignant memory. "She used to sit right there," he said, pointing to a small chair near the front window. "She'd wait for me to finish work, swinging her legs, counting the toys on the shelf. She loved that dollhouse, wanted one just like it." Grace felt her eyes well up, realizing how much her grandmother must have cherished this place, this shop that her grandfather had built with his own hands. She felt a deep sense of belonging, of roots that went far deeper than she'd ever known. But the peace was short-lived. As Christmas approached, an unexpected visitor arrived in town. Martin, a man who claimed to be the rightful owner of the property where Pennywhistle Toys stood. He was the son of a wealthy businessman who had loaned money to Mr. Hawkins years ago, and he was here to collect the debt. Martin walked into the shop one evening with a confident, almost smug smile. "Mr. Hawkins, it's been a long time," he said, his tone polite but with an undercurrent of threat. "You owe my family quite a bit, and I'm afraid we're here to settle the score, either pay up or vacate the property by the new year." Grace's heart sank as she listened to their exchange. She knew the shop was all Mr. Hawkins had left, a place filled with memories, with love, with the legacy of his family. She couldn't bear to think of him losing it. But Mr. Hawkins remained calm, his voice steady. "I don't have that kind of money," he replied, meeting Martin's gaze with quiet determination. Martin shrugged, as if he'd expected that answer. "Well then, I guess you'll have to pack up. Business is business, after all." Grace felt a surge of anger rise within her. She couldn't just stand by and watch her grandfather lose everything. After Martin left, she turned to Mr. Hawkins, her voice fierce. "We can't let him take this place. There has to be something we can do." But Mr. Hawkins shook his head, his expression resigned. "I don't want you to worry about this, Grace. I've made my peace with it. I've lost enough in my life. If it's time to let go, then maybe it's for the best." Grace couldn't believe his words. How could he just give up? This shop, this place, was a part of him, a part of her family's history. She couldn't stand by and let it slip away. Over the next few days, Grace worked tirelessly, reaching out to friends, neighbors, anyone who might be able to help save the shop. She told them about Mr. Hawkins, about his history, about the love he poured into each toy he made. Slowly, word spread, and people from the community began to rally around them. A group of townsfolk gathered outside Penny Whistle Toys on Christmas Eve, some holding signs that read, "Save Our Toy Shop." Others brought their own children, sharing stories of the joy the shop had brought them over the years. Even Martin seemed taken aback by the overwhelming support, his confident facade slipping as he watched the crowd gather. Inside the shop, Grace and Mr. Hawkins watched from the window, astonished by the turnout. "I didn't realize all these people cared," Mr. Hawkins said, his voice choked with emotion. Grace squeezed his hand, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. "You've touched so many lives, Grandpa. This shop isn't just yours. It belongs to everyone who has ever walked through that door." Just as the night grew colder, Martin entered the shop again, his face stern but uncertain. "Look," he said, glancing at the crowd outside. "I didn't come here to be the bad guy. Maybe we can work something out." Mr. Hawkins met his gaze, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Maybe we can." As they shook hands, Grace felt a warmth spread through her heart. This was more than a shop, more than toys. It was a place where family, friendship, and community came together, a place that had brought her closer to her own past, and, she realized, closer to her future. For Mr. Hawkins, it was a Christmas he would never forget, a Christmas that had given him back the family he thought he'd lost forever. The town's efforts to save Penny Whistle Toys had warmed Mr. Hawkins's heart in a way he hadn't felt in years. He looked out each evening at the families who passed by, many of them stopping to wave or drop by with a donation, no matter how small. The holiday season was in full swing, and the shop had transformed into a beacon of Christmas spirit for Cedarville, a place that people now saw not just as a store, but as a piece of their shared history. However, despite the community's generous support, the debt was formidable. Grace did her best to remain hopeful, but each night as she counted the donations, she knew they were still far short. Mr. Hawkins, sensing her worry, would often pat her shoulder with a gentle smile. "We've already come further than I ever thought possible," he'd say. But the underlying sadness in his voice told her he wasn't entirely ready to believe they could win this fight. Then, on Christmas Eve, as snowflakes drifted down like feathers outside, Mr. Hawkins asked Grace to stay late with Emma. He wanted to close up the shop together, just the three of them. The old man moved about the store, carefully turning off the lights one by one, each flickering out like a memory he was trying to lock away. Grace watched him in silence, her heart breaking for this man who had found his family again, only to lose his life's work. The doorbell jingled suddenly, and the three of them turned to see Martin standing there. He was bundled up against the cold, his face set with a look of finality. Grace tensed, immediately sensing that this visit was not going to be pleasant. Martin stepped inside, brushing the snow from his coat. "I didn't expect to see so many people rallying behind you," he said, his tone almost admiring. He cast a glance around the dimly lit shop, his gaze landing on the toys, the shelves, the care with which each piece had been crafted. "It's rare to find this kind of attachment to a place these days." Mr. Hawkins nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "I've put my life into this shop. People know that, and they remember." Martin took a deep breath. "That may be true, but I still have an obligation to my family's business." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a paper. "You have until midnight tonight to pay the remainder, or the property reverts back to my family." "I'm sorry, Mr. Hawkins. This is how things work." Grace felt a surge of anger and desperation. She stepped forward, unable to hold back. "Doesn't family mean anything to you?" she demanded. "This place is all he has left. He's been here his whole life, and you're just going to take it away." Martin's face softened slightly, but he held firm. "I have a job to do, miss. I can't just ignore a debt that's owed." With a heavy sigh, he gave them one last, almost apologetic look before turning to leave. As the door closed behind him, Grace felt an overwhelming wave of helplessness. Midnight was only a few hours away, and no miracle was coming. That night, the three of them sat in the back room of Penny Whistle Toys, the only light coming from a small, flickering candle on the table. Emma was busy playing with her dollhouse, humming a Christmas tune to herself, blissfully unaware of the weight pressing down on the adults around her. Grace couldn't bring herself to leave. The thought of the shop closing, of this chapter ending so abruptly, was too much to bear. Mr. Hawkins reached into a drawer and pulled out a small box, which he placed in front of her. "Open it," he said softly. Grace lifted the lid to find an old pocket watch, its surface scratched and worn from years of use. She turned it over and saw a small engraving on the back, "To my beloved James, until we meet again." Her eyes filled with tears as she realized this was a gift from his late wife, a piece of their history that he'd kept close all these years. Mr. Hawkins's voice was soft, filled with a sadness she hadn't heard before. "I never thought I'd find family again. But then you walked into this shop, you and Emma, and it's like I was given a second chance." He placed a hand over hers, his touch warm. "No matter what happens, Grace, you've given me the best Christmas I could have hoped for." Grace gripped his hand, her heart breaking for him. But even in this moment of defeat, she felt a surge of determination. This couldn't be the end. Not like this. Just as the clock neared midnight, a car pulled up outside the shop, its headlights casting long shadows across the snow-covered street. Grace, curious, rose and peeked through the window, her heart skipping a beat. It was Martin. She saw him hesitate before stepping out, holding a small, carefully wrapped package. She frowned, watching as he approached the shop, his breath visible in the cold night air. Martin knocked lightly, and Grace opened the door, wary. He stepped inside, looking uncertain for the first time since he'd arrived in town. I wanted to talk to Mr. Hawkins," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Mr. Hawkins stepped forward, regarding Martin with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. Martin took a deep breath, his expression conflicted. "I didn't want to come here tonight. I don't like doing this kind of work, especially not during the holidays. But I came because I wanted to return something." He held out the small package to Mr. Hawkins, who took it with a puzzled look. Opening it, Mr. Hawkins found an old leather wallet with faded initials carved into the corner. His eyes widened as he recognized it instantly. This had belonged to his daughter, a keepsake she'd taken with her when she left all those years ago. He had thought it lost forever. Martin explained, his voice shaking slightly. "My father kept it all these years. He said he'd found it abandoned, left behind when she left this town. I didn't understand why he kept it until now." The realization hit Mr. Hawkins, and he staggered slightly, clutching the wallet close to his chest. She left it for me," he murmured, the words barely escaping his lips. The tension in the room was palpable. Grace watched, astonished, as Martin's face softened, his own eyes filling with emotion. "I understand what it's like to lose family," he said quietly, "and I don't want to be the one to take your family's legacy away." He paused as though gathering the courage to say the next words. "Consider the debt forgiven." Grace gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she looked between Martin and Mr. Hawkins, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Mr. Hawkins was speechless, his eyes wide with shock and gratitude. You mean it?" Martin nodded, his face softened with a rare kindness. "This place means more to you than it ever could to me. My family doesn't need another building. I think your family needs it more." The clock struck midnight, and the bells from the church tower echoed through the quiet town. A fresh wave of snow began to fall, blanketing the streets in a glistening coat. Grace, overcome with emotion, hugged Mr. Hawkins tightly, tears streaming down her face. Emma ran over, joining in the embrace, her laughter filling the room with a warmth that seemed to drive away the chill. Martin, standing in the doorway, gave them one last nod before stepping out into the night, disappearing into the snow as quietly as he had come. For the first time in years, Mr. Hawkins felt a deep sense of peace. His shop, his life's work, had been saved. But more than that, he had found the family he thought he'd lost forever. Grace felt it too, a feeling of belonging she hadn't known she was missing. Together, they stood in the quiet, the warmth of the candlelight casting a soft glow over them as they held on to each other, the joy of this unexpected miracle filling their hearts. It was a Christmas they would never forget, a Christmas that had given them not just gifts, but a chance to be family again. The morning after Christmas, Cedarville awoke to a rare kind of peace, a quiet snowfall, the soft light of dawn stretching over the rooftops, and a sense of warmth that seemed to hang in the very air. Word of the miracle at Penny Whistle Toys had spread quickly, and as Grace, Emma, and Mr. Hawkins unlocked the shop for the first time in the new year, they found that it had become a place of pilgrimage for the townspeople. Inside, Mr. Hawkins moved with renewed purpose, setting each toy with care, his gaze often drifting to Grace and Emma with a warmth he didn't bother hiding. He was a changed man, his once guarded manner replaced by a quiet pride. The shop had survived the threat of closure, but more importantly, he had discovered his family. For him, this was the true miracle, an impossible gift he'd never expected to receive. That morning, Grace found herself reflecting on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. She'd entered the shop one cold day looking for a small gift for her daughter, but what she had found was something priceless. Family, roots, and the beginning of a legacy. For the first time in years, she felt that she belonged somewhere, connected not just to the shop, but to a history that stretched back further than she'd ever realized. And Emma, always perceptive in her own quiet way, sensed it too, her innocent smile lighting up whenever she looked at her mother and Mr. Hawkins together. As the day went on, visitors came by to wish them well, offering congratulations and small gifts as tokens of their gratitude. One of the visitors was an elderly woman who had grown up with Mr. Hawkins's daughter. She shared stories of their childhood, painting pictures of the woman Grace's grandmother had been, spirited, strong-willed, and always dreaming of something more. Grace listened, drinking in every detail, piecing together a portrait of a grandmother she had only known in bits and pieces. By afternoon, the shop was bustling with children's laughter and the delighted voices of parents recalling their own memories of the little store. Grace found herself working harder than ever, yet it felt effortless, as if she were exactly where she was meant to be. That evening, as the shop finally emptied out and the quiet settled in, Mr. Hawkins motioned for Grace and Emma to join him in the back room. He led them to a small, locked cabinet near his workbench and retrieved a slender, carved wooden box. Grace watched with curiosity as he opened it, revealing a set of delicate hand-carved ornaments, each one unique and painted with intricate design. "These were your grandmother's," he said, lifting out one of the ornaments and handing it to Grace. "She made them herself. Wanted to start a tradition, you know. I think she would have wanted you to have them." Grace's eyes filled with tears as she took the ornament, a small bird with red wings, painted with remarkable detail. She ran her fingers over the carving, feeling a connection to her grandmother through the delicate wood. Emma, sensing the significance of the moment, took an ornament too, a tiny snowflake with blue and silver details, and held it with wonder. Mr. Hawkins smiled as he watched them, the warmth of family settling around them like a blanket. He took a deep breath, a look of contentment crossing his face. "You know, for the longest time, I thought I'd end my days here alone," he admitted, his voice tinged with the slightest hint of vulnerability. "I'd made peace with it, but then, here you both are." Grace squeezed his hand, her voice full of emotion. "We're not going anywhere," she assured him. "This is our home now, too." They spent the rest of the evening decorating a small Christmas tree in the back room with the ornaments, each one a piece of their family's story, a memory they were honoring together. For Mr. Hawkins, it was as though he were reliving those lost years, sharing them with his newfound family. In the weeks that followed, Grace found herself not only working at Penny Whistle Toys, but taking on a larger role in the shop's operations. Mr. Hawkins, recognizing her natural talent for managing and connecting with customers, began to entrust her with more of the shop's day-to-day responsibilities. It became clear that he saw her as more than just an employee. He saw her as his legacy. One day, as they closed up shop, Mr. Hawkins handed her the keys, his eyes filled with pride and gratitude. "You're ready to carry this forward, Grace," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I want this shop to be yours, for you and for Emma. It's time for me to step back a bit. Maybe just enjoy seeing the shop through your eyes." Grace was stunned, overwhelmed by the enormity of the gift. She tried to protest, but Mr. Hawkins held up a hand, his smile kind but firm. "It's yours, Grace. This shop was always meant to be passed down to family, and you are my family." With that, the torch was passed. Grace, filled with a profound sense of purpose, accepted the key, a promise to honor the past and build a future where her daughter, too, could find a place to belong. On the first Christmas in her new role as the shop's owner, Grace stood by the front window with Emma, watching the snow fall gently on the streets of Cedarville. Customers had come in all day, filling the shop with warmth and laughter, sharing memories and stories. Mr. Hawkins sat comfortably near the back, quietly observing with a proud smile, content in the knowledge that his life's work was in safe hands. Emma turned to her mother, her eyes wide with excitement. "Will we make toys forever, Mommy?" she asked, her innocent gaze full of wonder. Grace laughed softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "As long as people need them," she replied, "and as long as we're here together." As the snow continued to fall outside, Grace looked over at Mr. Hawkins, who caught her gaze and gave a small, grateful nod. In that moment, she realized that the true gift of Christmas was not in the toys or the decorations, but in the love that had brought them together, the family they had become. Penny Whistle Toys stood as a testament to that love, a place that held their shared history and a promise for the future. And in the glow of the shop's lights, with her daughter by her side and her grandfather nearby, Grace knew that this Christmas and everyone after it would be filled with the warmth of family, a legacy passed down with love. If you felt the warmth of this story and believe in the power of family, love, and second chances, please subscribe to HeroKind Stories and leave a comment. Share this tale of hope with someone who needs a little holiday magic in their life, and let them know that it's never too late to find where you belong. Keep watching, because the next story will inspire you even more.